All right, our main topic tonight, dinosaurs, for the next 30 minutes or so. A Bible verse, Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. I've used this with you guys before, I'm sure you remember. Let this mind be in you that was also in Christ. Of course, in the context of Philippians, Paul is talking to the church in Philippi, saying, let your conduct, let your brotherly love be like Christ. Let it be Christ-like. But it's a really good statement to apply elsewhere as well, including into the world of dinosaurs. You see, dinosaurs, people have lots of questions about them. It's a stumbling block for many people. Many people think that, well, you have to believe in evolution if you want to believe in dinosaurs. How can, therefore, that idea, that concept of dinosaurs fit into the Bible? Well, if we're going to get to the bottom of these big questions, we need to be thinking about the world the way that Jesus Christ thinks about the world. So what do the scriptures reveal to us about the history of the world? Well, it starts in the beginning with God created. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 1. God made each after its own kind. God made man in his image, and God created the world very good. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. And of course, you and I view the word good as a moral word, and it is, but it's a lot more than that, because God actually described what his very good creation was like. He said in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 and 30, all creatures were vegetarian. They were only given permission to eat plants, no meat whatsoever. Now, of course, this has been a little bit different to the world that we live in today. And of course, you find out by the time you get to Genesis chapter 3, man has now sinned, God curses the ground, death has entered the world, and the world has gone from good to bad. And then by the time you get down to Noah's flood, the Bible says that the thoughts and the intents of mankind's heart was only evil continually, and so God judged the world with a global flood. The world had changed from good to bad to worse. Well, there's the foundations. Let's turn to the dinosaurs. A few weeks ago, literally only 4 or 5 weeks ago, we were up at the Hells Creek Formation in Glendive, Montana, and we were digging up dinosaur bones. I say we, that was me, that was Craig Hawkins, who you met earlier, it was the Goke family who are here tonight, and it was our colleagues over from Arkansas, Glenn and Ruby Wilson. I believe they've visited here last year. So you have plenty of dinosaurs in the USA, but then you guys know that. But we have a fair few dinosaur locations in the UK as well. Here you can see John Mackay underneath a big cliff. I took him here a number of years ago, way back in 2016, I think it was, because we were going there to dig up dinosaurs. You see the big red layer? You see the sort of grey layer at the top? Well, that grey layer up the top is known as Jurassic rocks. Jurassic rocks are named after the rocks in the Jura Mountains. Nothing to do with millions of years or evolution, everything to do with where they were first studied. And you can find dinosaur bones there. You might just be able to spot the dinosaur bone here. There's the arrow pointing to it. It's kind of coming down and curving around. It's part of a rib. In fact, you can actually see on the table down here some of those dinosaur bones that were excavated from the Hells Creek Formation just a few weeks ago. Come and speak to the people who even excavated them. But there's plenty of stuff to be found in the UK, including these big chunks of dinosaur bone just lying there loose on the beach. In fact, if you go to the Isle of Wight, a small island off the coast, the south coast of the United Kingdom, it's the dinosaur capital of Europe. It is the 6th best place in the world for diversity of dinosaur bones, and not very many people, even on the Isle of Wight, know that. But you can find some pretty amazing stuff, such as this dinosaur skull that we excavated a few years ago. Of course, one of the downsides of being on a small island off the coast of another small island is that you're kind of governed by tides. You don't have to worry about that in places like the Grand Canyon or up in the Hells Creek Formation. But in the United Kingdom, more often than not, the place that you're digging fossils up, you're governed by tides. And of course, if the tide comes in, you don't want it to cut you off and you drown. So it does mean that you do end up on the beach at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to excavate the dinosaur skull that you found earlier. So if you come on field trips, well, you Don't actually have to do that if you don't want to. But many of the field trips that we lead all over the world, including a couple in the next few days, speak to Cheryl if you want to find out more about the field trips we've been doing. But you can find some really good fossils with us, including things like dinosaur bones. So dinosaurs are found all over the world for sure, and dinosaur bones are found there, and dinosaur bones are what prove to us that these creatures once existed. We really do go out and we really do dig up these bones of these great big creatures. In fact, the man who invented the name dinosaur, Sir Richard Owen, from the Natural History Museum, he founded the Natural History Museum in London, the big famous one. He said that dinosaurs were, quote unquote, the monsters God made. And he didn't mean a monster as in sort of like, big scary monster. He just meant great big creature. In fact, he even called dinosaurs, which means terrible lizard. And again, not terrible as in really bad, but terrible as in really big. These were the really big creatures that God made. So we know that they exist, but as you dig up these dinosaur bones, there are a few questions to be asked. How do dinosaur fossils form? What evidence do they show? Do they show evidence of millions of years and slow burial? Or do they show evidence of a quick flood burial? That's what we're going to investigate now. Excuse me. I have some terrible allergies that have popped up for some reason. And the question we're going to deal with is, who is your authority? Is it God's unchanging word, or is it man's continually evolving theories? Which one does the evidence best fit? Well, let's start with this. How did these dinosaurs get into the rocks? One children's book, easily accessible in the UK. How an animal can become a fossil. Step 1, the animal dies and sinks to the bottom of the sea and it's covered by sediment. Step 2, the body dissolves, leaving a mold. The mold fills up with sediment and minerals and it becomes a cast, and then eventually through erosion you end up with a dinosaur fossil. Now there's an awful lot wrong with this. Bear in mind this is a children's book, and I know you have to simplify things for children's books, but outright lies don't tend to go down too well. I mean, for starters, the fossils that we find are the actual bones. We're not dealing with a cast, we're not dealing with a copy, we're dealing with the actual dinosaur bones. The process is called permineralization, literally permeated with minerals. But the actual dinosaur bone is still there. It's not become a cast. But there's another question. A question which isn't raised here, but is presented here. You see, the question that you have to ask is, step 1, an animal dies and sinks to the bottom of the sea. Okay, question. What is a 2-story tall, 40-ton dinosaur doing out at the sea in the first place in order to be able to be buried? Because this is a land dinosaur. This is a big land dinosaur. What's he doing out in the middle of the sea waiting to die in order to get buried? Because they actually have it right. The evidence does seem to suggest that most of these creatures got buried in water, in marine sediments. But how did it get there? Well, and it's not a small animal, these are big creatures. So the only real explanation that you've got is that some kind of a flood actually swept them out to sea. And of course, these are big creatures, so therefore it must have been a pretty big flood. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Here's a slightly more technical diagram from a museum in the UK about a dinosaur dying and becoming a fossil. Step 1, the dinosaur collapses and dies. Poor Mr. Dinosaur. Flesh rots away and the bones remain. The water level rises and it buries those bones. And then eventually, you see the big long arrow of time? You see, the story that they tell you in books, in media, in museums, is that fossilization, that's turning a creature into a fossil, preserving it in rock, not necessarily turning it to stone, but preserving it in stone, is a very slow process. And then, of course, the Bible says, test all things, hold fast to what is good, in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. So let's do some testing. Let's go to the fossils of the USA. Let's go to the National Dinosaur Monument where you can see Camarasaurus. And his head is thrown up in the air and his tail is up in the air as well. And his legs are sort of splayed out underneath. Now, I hope you realize when you go to a museum and you see your dinosaur skeleton in your museum and it's doing a nice pose like this, that's not how we dug the thing up. In fact, most dinosaur bones we find are very fragmentary. But whenever we do find complete or partially complete dinosaur bones, dinosaur skeletons, this is what they look like, with their head thrown back and their tail in the air. There's from the same place, Allosaurus. In fact, you can go up to Canada, into the southern Alberta Badlands. I was up in the southern Alberta, in the Badlands of northern Montana. They kind of spread from Montana up into Canada. We were there just a few weeks ago, as I said, digging up these dinosaur bones. Amazing stuff to be found. We got to go and visit the Glendive Dinosaur Museum and see just the sheer volume of fossils that you get out of the Hells Creek Formation. And the Hells Creek Formation and the Badlands have got some very interesting complete dinosaurs as well. Here's one. Notice the same position, head in the air, tail in the air. There's another one. There's Gorosaurus. Look at the position of that neck. We really are dealing with a strange phenomena here, with the head thrown back, the mouth open, the tail in the air, and the legs squashed up underneath. So what is going on with all of the dinosaurs in the Badlands of the USA and of Canada? Well, it's not just the dinosaurs of the USA and of Canada. You can come to the UK. You come down to the south coast, to the famous Jurassic coast, and you can see Scelidosaurus. There's the artist's impression. There's the fossil one. Well, that's a picture of the fossil one because, you see, they wouldn't allow you to take pictures of the real fossil, so we had to go and find the owner and get his permission to take the photos. But just look at the complete skeleton there. You see the head thrown up, the tail in the air, the legs squashed. It's the same overall position, but this fossil has got another feature, a really strange and slightly disgusting feature. Because you see, here's the owner pointing out the real fossil, and he's pointing out something quite remarkable. Because by the time you get there and you look at the throat, it's actually still got food there in his throat. And you can tell whether the food is on its way down or on its way back up by how digested it is. And indeed, you can trace this food all the way down this creature's throat, and there is food still in its stomach. This is a dinosaur that is vomiting. It's been caught up and it's been squashed so suddenly and so violently, it's forced that food back up its throat. Now, that's a revolting thing to think about on a Sunday evening, but it makes a really important point. You see, this is a dinosaur that was killed and buried violently. This wasn't a dinosaur that was dying and just lying around for a while. This is a dinosaur that got buried alive. This is a dinosaur with food in its stomach, vomit in its throat. It's been squashed and it's buried with seashells. That very fact alone tells you that this creature drowned. And it drowned in a flood because whenever you find land creatures and seashells and plants all buried together in one deposit, you've got very good evidence of a flood. Creatures and animals that do not belong together in the real world being buried together in the same sediment is very good evidence of a flood. And indeed, you can trace the flood deposits all the way up the United Kingdom. You can see the evidence of flooding in the rocks in the UK. It's the same story in that famous Isle of Wight bed. Here's the most complete iguanodon dinosaur fossil that's ever been found from the Isle of Wight. In fact, ever been found in the United Kingdom. Now, the local museum where this is on display has very helpfully put this big sort of grid pattern of windows in front of it, so you can't really see it all that clearly, but just to help you out, there's the head up there, there's the neck, follow the curvature of the neck, and have a look at the diagram of how it was found. Hey, it's the same thing. There's the head bent backwards, the tail splayed, and the legs sort of splayed out as well. So what's going on with these dinosaurs? Because it's the same in the USA, it's the same in the UK. Well, in one of your big science conferences, specifically about fossils and dinosaurs, a very interesting report was published. And this report got reported on itself by a magazine called New Scientist. New Scientist is sort of a science magazine that takes very technical journal articles and puts it into sort of layman's terms that like the likes of I and you can sort of understand. Well, this is what they had to say. Many dinosaurs are found with their head and their neck bent backwards and their tail arched over their back. Immersion in water is the simplest explanation. In other words, the easiest and simplest explanation for why these dinosaurs are found like this all over the planet is because they drowned. In fact, here's a brand new fossil find from the Isle of Wight. I was involved in some of the reporting on this, found at a place called Shanklin, and they said it was very unusual. And it is. I've been to Shanklin many times. I've never found dinosaur bones there. And they said it's very unusual. And why was it unusual? Because it was found mixed with fossil oyster shells. In fact, there's the report that the museum had out. Let's zoom in on it a little bit. Zoom into that section. Look at what it has to say. There was this creature that was found. It's very strange to have found it there, but look at what they said. It's likely that our dinosaur was living on land just a few miles away to the north, where it was what? Caught up in a flood. In fact, there's the picture on display in the museum of a dinosaur drowning in the flood. Oh no, this isn't a creationist museum. This is a secular museum. But even they can't deny the overwhelming evidence that these creatures drowned. There's the dinosaur in the dead dinosaur pose, and look at what he's about to be buried next to. Bunch of seashells. Well, it's not just the UK, and it's not just the USA. It's Germany. Tail in the air, head bent backwards, mouth open, legs squashed up underneath. It's Italy. Head thrown back, mouth open, tail in the air, legs squashed up underneath. It's in Nigeria and Africa. Look at the curvature on that spine. Wow. I mean, they haven't even excavated the skull yet, but it's the same thing. It's Canada, and it's all over the world. And remember the point? Immersion in water is the simplest explanation. The evidence is that all of these dinosaurs did indeed drown. Let's go one step further. Daspletosaurus in a museum in Canada. There's the sign. Daspletosaurus was a large carnivore with powerful jaws. It was collected, and it's got this classic death pose with the neck pulled back over its body, the tail arched forwards, and the hind limbs tightly flexed. This pose is common amongst the park's meat-eating dinosaurs, and it's an indication of what? A central nervous system trauma at the time of death related to drowning. One drawing, one picture, one painting of drowning dinosaurs. But no, again, this is not a picture that I've got one of our artists to draw of dinosaurs drowning in Noah's flood. It's actually on display at Dinosaur Provincial Park. By no means any friend of the Bible, by no means any friend of creation, and yet even they can't deny the overwhelming evidence that these creatures drowned in a flood. In fact, sometimes it pays to take a step back and look at the big picture. I've been mentored by John Mackay, who's visited this church many times, and you'll know of his stories and accounts of traveling all over the world. I've barely done a fraction of that, but I've had the privilege of traveling in many different places around the world, and I've seen the evidence for myself. These are creatures that are found drowned all over the world. In fact, they're not just drowned, by the way. They're drowned and they've been buried real quick. How do we know? Well, research has now shown that these dinosaurs had to be buried within 3 minutes, otherwise they would revert back to a natural pose. How do we know that? Well, you remember that description of a central nervous system trauma? The reality is all living creatures do this. Whenever you're about to drown, the very last thing that your body does is it sends a shockwave down your spine to make you go, "Gah!" Now, I don't have a tail or a long neck, so my body doesn't quite look like a dinosaur's, but it's the same reaction. And in any creatures that have a long neck, their neck bends backwards. In any creatures that have a long tail, their tail arches upwards. In any creatures that have legs, they squish up. And you look like a drowned dinosaur. The problem is that if you've drowned in water, of course, you are now dead. You've got no control over your body, and you're suspended in water. And so very quickly your head will flop forward, your tail will flop down, and no longer will you look like a drowned dinosaur. In fact, if you want to actually be preserved in that position, you have to be buried in sediment to stop you from going into any other position within 3 minutes. These are creatures that have been drowned. These are dinosaurs which have been buried in water very rapidly. They've been found all over the world. It's starting to sound an awful lot like a global flood. But note very well, it's not the evidence that contradicts the Word of God. It's the opinions of mankind. In fact, if you want a fossil, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with a process. Let me share with you briefly about some of the recent research that I've been doing into the world of dinosaurs, particularly to do with dinosaur cells and fibers, soft, squidgy stuff inside dinosaur bones that really shouldn't be there if these things are millions of years old. Now, a point for prayer, we are submitting, once I get back to the UK in about a week and a half's time, we are submitting a paper to the journal Nature, a very prestigious journal, all about our most recent research. In fact, if you want to find out about our most recent research, we have a report from the University of Liverpool, authored by myself and a few others. If you want the technical side of things, I'd encourage you to pick one of those up. But for this sort of introduction, we're going to deal with another paper, a paper that was published a few years back in 2015. It just gives us a bit of an oversight as to what's been actually found. Published in the Nature Communications, which is part of the Nature family of publications. There's the title, Fibers and Cellular Structures Preserved in 75-million-year-old Dinosaur Specimens. What did they do? Well, they used a technique called scanning electron microscopy in order to study dinosaur bones from Dinosaur Park Formation in Alberta in Canada. These bones were collected in the early 20th century, so 100 years ago or so, and they were held in the Natural History Museum in London in the UK. There's some examples from the paper of what they used, a theropod claw and some ribs. So what did they find? Well, in the theropod claw, they found erythrocyte-like structures. We all know what erythrocytes are, yeah? Well, they're red blood cells. Scientists like using big technical words to confuse people, but erythrocytes are simply red blood cells. In the hadrosaur leg and foot bones, they found fibrous structures full of carbon. In the ceratopsid bone, they found more of those erythrocyte-like structures, the red blood cells. And in the rib from the unknown species, they found collagen-like fibers. Collagen is a very fibrous protein that's found in bones. You'll probably know collagen. You get it in skin creams and hair. You make your hair grow and your skin glow and all that. Well, collagen is actually a protein. It's a soft, squidgy material, much like skin and meat and muscle things are proteins. And it's found in bones as well as skin and hair. It helps to hold your bones together. It's a very fibrous protein. Well, what about these dinosaur names? Well, the theropods are these bipedal dinosaurs with the small clawed front limbs. Think T-Rex, right? That's perhaps the most famous dinosaur of all, and certainly the most famous theropod. The hadrosaurs were the duck-billed dinosaurs. The ceratopsids were the horned dinosaurs. Cera, horn, top on your head. So these are the horned dinosaurs, like, of course, Triceratops. Well, they said there was a problem in this paper, a problem about preservation. They said it's long been accepted that protein molecules decay in relatively short periods of time and cannot be preserved for longer than 4 million years. Now, I would actually contest that number. In fact, so would the biggest critic of this research. And sometimes the biggest critic of me is my best friend, because you see, a man called Michael Buckley from the University of Manchester, his quote is, "There is less than 1% chance of less than 1% protein, collagen protein, existing in less than 1 million years." In other words, he's using the lessers to kind of cover his back. But by the time you get to 1 million years, according to his research, you should have no collagen left in the bones whatsoever. The problem is that I'm finding collagen in bones that are supposed to be up to 200 million years old. And his response is that cannot simply be possible, because protein could not last more than 1 million years. His problem is that I turn around and say, I'm very happy with that, because I don't believe they're millions of years old. But if you were, just for the sake of the argument for now, let's go with the 4 million years mark. The point they're making is that protein can't last for longer than 4 million years, given our understanding of science. Therefore, they say, even in cases where organic material is preserved, it's generally accepted that only parts of original proteins are preserved and that the full tertiary or quaternary structure has been lost. In other words, if we do find any organic materials, anything older than this, then they should just be really decayed, really broken down, hardly identifiable. But the problem is, we observe, they said, structures resembling calcified collagen fibers from modern bone, structures enriched in carbon, and structures that resemble erythrocytes or red blood cells from birds. Now, don't worry too much about the ins and outs of the scientific techniques here. Just look at some of the pictures, because what we're going to do, we're going to compare the two. We're going to compare what they found with modern-day examples. These were all published in that paper. On the top, you can see fibers that they found inside the dinosaur rib. In the bottom, you can see collagen fibers from a modern animal. Now, the top is definitely more decayed. But then you would expect that, because collagen, even though it's a tough protein, it still decays pretty quickly. Even after just a few years, it begins to decay. But they do match. You can see this knobbly-bobbly looking stuff. This is under a special technique with a scanning electron microscope, and the different colors are different depths of field underneath the microscope. And again, you can match stuff from animals to these erythrocyte-like structures, these red blood-like structures inside the theropod claw. More examples from the dinosaur rib, this fibery organic stuff. In fact, there's the stuff from the dinosaur rib on the on the left-hand side there, and stuff from the modern bone on the right-hand side. Again, you can match, and this is not a one-off publication. There are now over 150 publications, not in creationist journals, but in secular, peer-reviewed, refereed scientific journals that report on original biomaterial, that soft tissue to the likes of you and me, inside these bones. Well, what's the big point? Well, a good guy to comment on it is Professor Ed Neeland. Professor Ed Neeland is an organic chemist. He makes molecules for a living. He knows how fragile they are. He knows how complex they are. And he had this to say about the discovery of these biomolecules inside these dinosaur bones. He said, red blood cells, intact proteins, and flexible tissues in these bones have a known shelf life. In other words, we know how long it takes for them to break down and decay. We've done experiments to try and slow down their decay. We know how fragile they are. He said, experimental evidence indicates shelf lifetimes running from months to perhaps thousands of years for certain proteins. So when a scientist claims to have found time-sensitive, in other words, short shelf-life chemicals inside an 80-million-year-old sample, this defies all of our experimental data. Something is wrong. He says it would be like finding a bottle of milk from 1951 and it being completely fresh. Impossible, in other words. He said, we know experimentally that blood and proteins are not structurally maintained over a long time. They degrade. That is a reproducible, testable, observable fact. The dating of bones, however, is more suspect and is based on some questionable assumptions. He concludes by saying the biblical creation model says that the universe and the earth are only thousands of years old, and that is in line with what is found inside dinosaur bone fossils. This is a clear-cut example where the evidence contradicts the evolution model's prediction and it supports the creation model's prediction. Let's come on to my research. One Jurassic crocodilian vertebrae. Why crocodilian? Because dinosaurs are cool, let's face it. People love dinosaurs. That's what gets published, right? Why did I choose a crocodilian? Well, I've done enough dinosaurs. We've tested over 8 different dinosaur bones for collagen. We've found collagen in all of them. Why did we choose crocodilian? Well, one of the big criticisms of this research is you cannot know whether the fossil material you're finding, the collagen that you're finding inside these fossils, is endogenous. What's endogenous? It means it originally belongs to the bone. In other words, the claim is they believe that what we're finding is contamination. How do we not know that I didn't accidentally spit in it or drop some skin in it? Or, how do we know that it wasn't a bacteria that was producing this collagen-like stuff? Well, the reason I tried to do a crocodilian bone is because even according to evolution, crocodilians have experienced what they call evolutionary stasis for over 200 million years. In other words, according to evolution, crocodiles haven't changed in 200 million years. Now, again, I don't believe that they're that old. I also think that that's a great piece of evidence that creatures don't evolve, because even according to evolution, crocodiles haven't evolved. But we can now do something which has never been done before. We can test an exact like-for-like example of a fossil. Believe it or not, that has never been done before in the world of science. Well, what do? Well, we took some nice, cool photos of the bone to start with. You can see all the internal structure. In fact, this is a great example to show you what a dinosaur bone, or indeed a crocodile bone, looks like when it becomes a fossil. Because what you can see here is that the bone has not turned to stone. That's a misnomer about a lot of fossils. What has happened here is a process called permineralization. You can see the red arrow there pointing to the yellow patch in the middle. They are minerals that have infilled the bone, but the black bone is still there. Even the bone itself, it's very porous. It's been infilled with minerals. Even the bone itself is very tiny microscopic holes that have been infilled, but the actual bone is still there. You can perhaps see it more clearly on the right-hand side. We've got all those little grains of minerals that have penetrated the bone. But the bone, that black stuff, is still there. So what do? Well, first of all, we take a very thin slice of the bone, call it a thin section, and we put it under a technique called cross-polarized light microscopy. What does that do? Well, it gives us some pretty pictures. Can you see all the red stuff? Can you see all the blue stuff? Well, X-pol light is interesting because it is a medical technique which is used to identify collagen inside modern bone samples. And it was a technique that was developed most recently by a scientist from the Institute of Creation Research, a colleague of mine. He did the same PhD that I'm doing at Liverpool University. And he said, I wonder if we can use this technique to look at modern collagen, will it work with fossil collagen? And they tested it. And indeed, they found inside this crocodilian bone, all the blue fluorescent patches is all evidence of collagen. So there's definitely collagen within this bone sample, but how do we know that it's endogenous? In fact, how do we even know that it's definitely collagen? Well, now we can do a technique called mass spectrometry. In mass spectrometry, we take that sample, we demineralize it, get rid of all the minerals, and we put it through a special machine, and it gives us a bunch of squiggly lines. And again, we won't go into the deep science, but what we're basically doing is we're looking to match the squiggly lines up with modern-day examples of collagen. So we use something like a bovine collagen or a modern-day alligator to compare it to. And what we found is that, yes, this bone is full of collagen. Now we can go one step further. We can do a technique called proteomics. Now, we're not quite reading the DNA here, but we're getting awfully close. What we're doing is we're actually sequencing, we're identifying which specific proteins, which peptides are there inside the collagen protein. Now, what did we discover? Well, what we found is that this Jurassic crocodilian bone has got biology in it that matches perfectly with the American alligator, with the Chinese alligator, and with the saltwater crocodile. In other words, number one, crocodiles haven't evolved. Even their biology is still the same. Number two, we have very good evidence that the collagen we're finding inside of this bone is endogenous. It does indeed belong to the bone. Why? Because we are finding crocodilian biology inside crocodilian bones. If it was a mistake, if I'd spat in it or dropped skin in it by accident, and by the way, we are very, very meticulous about how we prepare these samples in a sterile environment, in sterilized instruments, making sure we take it only from deep inside the bone. But even if it was contamination, it should have come up with human. Or at very least, it should be mammalian. I'd have been happy if it was just simply reptilian. But no, we were actually able to identify 3 different peptides, 3 different parts of that protein, which matches with 3 different modern-day crocodilians, which tells you that not only is it endogenous, as Ed Nealon put it, it's a real big blow to the theory of evolution that these things really are indeed millions of years old. By the way, you can find out a whole bunch about this project. You can pick up the research paper if you like all the sciencey stuff, or we've got a documentary. I don't think it's here tonight, but it's available to purchase online and to watch online, called The Dinosaur Project. You can see about it at the dinosaur-project.com, where we've interviewed a bunch of scientists dealing with this, and I've been privileged enough over the last few years to be involved in this research, and I would ask that you pray for the future publications that will be coming out about this as well. You see, as we wrap up, the big thing that we all need to make sure we're doing, and the challenge that I make to everybody who is involved in this kind of research, in this kind of interest or understanding, is to take off Charles Darwin's glasses and to start seeing things God's way. By the way, that's the statue of Charles Darwin outside the school which he was taught at, less than 20 minutes away from our Creation Museum. We didn't plan that. It turns out God has a sense of humor. But you see, the challenge is everybody views the world through lenses. Are you going to view the world the way that Darwin viewed the world, which, let's face it, is a pretty bleak view of the world? Or are you going to start seeing things God's way, which says that even though the world is now bad, that's not how it started off. Things started off very good. Man messed up, man sinned, God cursed the ground, and the world went from good to bad to worse. And in my opinion, one of the bad things that happened was the extinction of the dinosaurs. I think it'd be cool to have some dinosaurs around, but let's dig up their fossils, let's believe that they were real creatures, but let's use the evidence, whether it's from their bones or indeed from their biology, let's use it to declare God's goodness and glory until he returns again. Let this mind be in you that is also in Christ. Let's start thinking about the world the way that Jesus Christ thinks about the world, and we'll do pretty well.